They came with the Bible and their religion. They stole our land and crushed our spirit, and now tell us we should be thankful to the Lord for being saved. Chief Pontiac.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we begin down the road to the American Revolution. The War for American Independence was a truly seismic event. Its aftershocks and reverberations inspired democratic revolutions all across the Western world, and its presence is conspicuous in American popular culture and memory. But the American Revolution was much more than a war between redcoats and Minutemen. It was a movement that traces its roots to the earliest colonial years, but one that began in earnest in the 18th century. As we move through the narrative of the American independence movement, pay special attention to the causes of the revolution. This lecture will focus on the long-term causes, but first we need to ask a big question. Was the American Revolution inevitable? A quick disclaimer on this question. As historians, we really can't answer it. Historians rely on evidence, so any exercise that aims to play out an alternate version of history is not truly academic, since evidence doesn't exist for things that never happened. Still, thinking through questions like this, while not useful to historians, is incredibly useful for citizens in a democracy. It gives us a chance to think about the decisions we're faced with, the choices we make, and the consequences of those choices. Grappling with cause and effect in this way can help us to learn from history and use it as a tool for modern-day decision-making. Lives and fortunes were lost in the American Revolution. The course of world history was changed forever. Could it have turned out differently? Let's dive into the movement, then you decide. Our discussion today will focus on the long-term causes of the American Revolution. These causes unfolded far in advance of the revolution itself, and at the time, they probably seemed benign. Much like a volcano that churns underground for decades before an eruption, long-term causes tend to be less noticeable to the people living through them. Still, they are of paramount importance because they created the conditions that allowed the American Revolution to eventually erupt. Let's get started with our first long-term cause, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment inspired new ideas in the colonies about the role of government and the rights of the people. Of course, we covered the Enlightenment in a previous episode, so we won't get too far into the weeds here. But it's difficult to overstate the role of Enlightenment thought in the American Revolution. It pervaded the entire movement. Patrick Henry's infamous exclamation, "Give me liberty or give me death," was essentially a repackaging of John Locke's analysis of natural rights. Thomas Jefferson didn't even bother to rephrase Locke in the Declaration of Independence. He basically just copied him. In the eyes of many Americans, the Revolution was not a war for land or money or even power. It was a war between an enlightened vision and an archaic one. Freedom against tyranny. Democracy against monarchy. Then again, the colonists had only tasted democracy because of the absence of British leadership in the colonies. Our second long-term cause is salutary neglect. Salutary neglect afforded American colonists the freedom to forge new economic and political systems in the colonies, rendering them less reliant on England. England's policy of salutary neglect, largely ignoring the colonies between 1607 and 1754, allowed those colonies to develop independently of the mother country. Not only did they develop their own patterns of trade, they also established democratic political systems that were incompatible with old world monarchies. These democratic governments were present throughout the colonies, and American colonists grew attached to their culture of self-government. Many of these local institutions served as models for what would become the Continental Congress and the United States government. Salutary neglect essentially gave the colonies a dry run of independence. They knew by 1776 that they would be able to survive on their own because they had already established political and economic systems that would sustain them. Another seed of the revolution was sowed when a religious movement swept the colonies. Our third long-term cause is the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening broke down barriers between the colonies, inspired a new sense of individualism, and normalized challenges to authority. We discussed the origin and course of the Great Awakening in a previous episode, so today we'll just focus on those parts relevant to the independence movement. The Awakening united the colonies by breaking down denominational barriers that had once separated them. Remember, preachers of the Great Awakening touted a broader version of Protestant Christianity that de-emphasized individual sects. Instead, they focused on the individual relationship with God. But this carried over to individualism in all aspects of life. It also resulted in challenges to traditional church authorities, which normalized the act of questioning authority in general. This individualism and inclination to challenge authority would become critical to the independence movement. With the Enlightenment, Salutary Neglect, and the Great Awakening, the American Revolution was perhaps fomenting decades before shots were ever fired. But one final long-term cause would set the wheels in motion, and it requires a little more explanation. Our fourth long-term cause is the French and Indian War, and its aftermath. The French and Indian War marked the end of Salutary Neglect, and the unintended effects of the war forced the British government to reconsider its relationship with the American colonies. The French and Indian War began in 1754, when territorial disputes in North America turned violent. By the mid-1700s, the British colonies were expanding to the north and west, while French colonies spread south and east from Canada. Friction ensued near the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley, key locations for fur trapping, agriculture, and trade. The territorial conflict in the New World ignited an old rivalry between Britain and France, and soon all of Europe was sucked into a major war. Globally, this conflict is known as the 7 Years' War, but fighting in North America endured for 9 years, so in this country, we remember it as the French and Indian War. The war is so named because of the central role that Native Americans played in the conflict. You'll remember from your survey of the European colonies that French settlers tended to have much better relationships with American Indians than did their British counterparts. While the British warred with natives over land use, the French coexisted by building trusting trade relationships, respecting native customs and culture, and even intermarrying with them. As a result, the majority of native participants in the 7 Years' War fought on the side of the French. The British were not totally without allies, however. The 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy did side with their British trading partners, and this alliance proved useful to the British effort. The French and Indian War can be interpreted as a long-term cause of the American Revolution for many reasons. One is that, for the first time, American colonists contemplated uniting in the interest of a common cause. Benjamin Franklin, an inventor, philosopher, and politician from Pennsylvania, proposed the Albany Plan of Union at the war's outset in 1754. The plan held that the 13 colonies should band together and each contribute soldiers towards the war effort. Pictured here is the first known political cartoon in the American colonies, illustrated by Franklin himself. We can clearly see that Franklin saw power in the idea of colonial unity. 20 years later, during the Revolutionary Movement, this very image gained popularity as a rallying symbol for the Patriots. Unfortunately for Old Ben, the Albany Plan of Union was ultimately rejected. The other colonies, especially in the southern region, were hesitant to risk the lives of their citizens in a war that, in their minds, only affected a few colonies in the north. Still, the Albany Plan of Union is seen as another step towards revolution, as the prospect of uniting the 13 colonies began to make its way into public debate. As for the war itself, it took 9 years for the British to win, but I think I can sum it up in about 30 seconds. Even though this became a global conflict, British War Minister William Pitt recognized that North America was the real prize. He organized a blockade of the North Atlantic that prevented the French from reinforcing their troops in Canada. With the French colonists isolated, the British were able to invade and capture Montreal and Quebec, the 2 most important French cities at the time. With those 2 cities under British control, the French were forced to surrender. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris 1763. Make sure you highlight the year. There will be another Treaty of Paris in 1783 that ends the Revolutionary War, but that's a story for another day. The 1763 Treaty of Paris resulted in a massive transfer of land rights on the North American continent. Britain assumed control of all French claims in Canada and the Ohio River Valley. Spain received the Louisiana Territory from France, and as you can see here, the French were essentially kicked off the continent completely. They were able to hold on to a few island colonies, namely Haiti, but they were clearly the losers at the negotiating table. So, how then did the British victory put the colonies on course for revolution? The answer lies in the unintended effects of the French and Indian War, of which there were many. First, military effects. The French and Indian War witnessed colonial troops, mostly farmers and laborers, fighting alongside professional British soldiers, or regulars. As you might imagine, a rivalry ensued between the two groups, even though they were fighting on the same side. The Redcoats found the colonial troops to be undisciplined, which they probably were, and the colonials found the Redcoats to be arrogant and crass, which they probably were. A mistrust developed between the two that endured long after the war's end. Rivalry turned later into resentment and, by 1770, outright contempt. Indeed, the mistrust foreshadowed events in the colonies that strained the relationship between American settlers and the Crown. Second, let's look at the social effects of the war. In particular, Native American relationships on the frontier. Remember, the terms of the Treaty of Paris 1763 held that Britain was to inherit all French colonial claims in the Ohio River Valley in Canada. But the Native Americans that fought alongside the French were not mentioned at all in the treaty. In fact, they weren't even allowed at the negotiating table. And while many tribes had maintained peaceful relations with French settlers, the incoming British colonists were not as friendly. Relations broke down quickly, and violence broke out yet again. The bulk of the fighting was a result of Pontiac's rebellion. Pontiac was an Ottawa war chief who had led a coalition of American Indian tribes against the British in the 7 Years' War. Having been left out of the peace treaty and continually harassed by British settlers, Pontiac continued the fight. The threat of violence was so pervasive that the British Crown was forced to leave troops in North America to defend the colonies. This will be important later, so keep it fresh in your mind. Finally, let's examine the economic effects of the war. Any war is expensive, especially one that drags on for nearly a decade. The economic toll of the French and Indian War on the British Empire was especially large. In the 1760s and 1770s, the British budget began to fail for several reasons. The war had caused massive debt, but also England was not bringing in enough profit from its colonies. The weight of more than a century of salutary neglect finally came to bear on the British Crown. The failure of the British to preserve a mercantilist economy cost them dearly in this economic downturn. Facing dire straits, the British recognized that they needed to raise revenues and cut their expenses. This required them to crack down on the colonies in a variety of ways. These actions represented an end to salutary neglect, and the American colonists were not crazy about losing their autonomy. A series of British laws and actions, and the colonial responses to them, set mother country and colony on a collision course. The specific actions that the British took to try and recover financially from the French and Indian War will be covered in the next lecture. In the meantime, you can think about the long-term causes as ingredients for a dinner recipe. In this case, the entree is the revolution. But the ingredients alone do not an entree make. Only when they're combined, stirred up, agitated, and cooked will they become the final product. Likewise, when these long-term causes, the Enlightenment, Great Awakening, salutary neglect, and the French and Indian War aftermath, were combined, the revolution began to take shape. Whether or not the war was inevitable remains up for debate, but certainly the ingredients were on the table. Next time, we'll look at the proximate causes or short-term triggers of the American Revolution. See you then.